Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and today we're looking at the European Union. What are its priorities, challenges, and future prospects? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Brexit is back in the news, at least here in the UK. A huge amount is said in the UK media about UK perspectives on how the talks are going and what the key issues are. But we hear much less about thinking within the EU. So we're going to explore that. But there's a whole lot of other stuff that the EU is also up to. It has just agreed its budget for the next few years. It is responding to the challenge of COVID-19 and seeking to address the global climate emergency. It's navigating its way through a rapidly changing world, with China on the rise and the United States about to reset its course under President Biden. It faces internal challenges too, not least from the erosion of democracy and the rule of law in especially Hungary and Poland. So we're going to take a good hard look at the European Union. And to do so, I'm joined by our very own team of EU experts, all based here in the UCL Department of Political Science. Dr. Valentina Amuso is lecturer teaching in political economy and comparative politics and focuses her research on questions to do with trade, technology, and innovation. Dr. Chris Vratil is lecturer in European politics and director of our MSc program in European politics and policy. His research is on democratic representation, political behaviour, and public opinion. And Dr. Nick Wright is lecturer teaching in EU politics. He works on the interaction between national foreign policy making and international institutions, particularly the EU. Valentina, Chris, and Nick, welcome all to UCL Uncovering Politics. Let's start with Brexit and the basic question of where we are now. So I should just explain that we're recording this on Monday, the 14th of December. And as things stand, talks on a possible trade deal between the UK and the EU remain ongoing, having limped through yet another deadline over the weekend. Now, that might have changed by the time this episode goes out on Thursday. We might have a deal, or the negotiations might have concluded without a deal, or the talks might still be continuing. We just don't know. So could I ask, first of all, do any of you have a sense of where you think these talks might be heading? Valentina, are you feeling optimistic, feeling pessimistic? What do you think might be going on here?
This is actually a $1 million question, because we have seen, those deadlines being postponed. We also see, a number of difficulties in reaching this agreement, which was kind of expected given the degree of integrations between the UK and the European Union. I'm not feeling very optimistic, I am afraid, maybe because I am Southern Italian. We tend to, be a bit, realistic, a bit, pessimistic about things, maybe because we have been consistently invaded by other populations. So we have that attitude towards life, I would say, but I'm not feeling extremely optimistic. It's an extremely difficult deal to reach. There are a number of controversies and there are a number of significant differences, which are also a matter of principle. I'm not 100% sure we will manage to have a deal, although that would be the best outcome for all parties involved.
Chris, are you any more optimistic than Valentina?
On the one hand, I'm more optimistic than Valentina in the sense that I think ultimately there will be a deal. No, ultimately the UK just in the long term can't live without a deal. So I think during the next month, at some point, we will see a deal emerge. The question is just when. And there I have held the opinion for a long time that with regard to 31st of December, we are most likely to go towards no deal. That just seems to me the calculation that the UK government is making, that it can't really give in before 31st of December to the EU's demand, and we may very well see no deal until 31st of December. However, come January, February, March, when we will see the fallout of no deal and the consequences of no deal, I think that the UK's position may actually soften, and that then we will see a deal at some point in the first half of 2021.
So that sounds pretty pessimistic to me as well. Nick, is there any hope?
I have to say, I share my two colleagues' views. To be honest, my optimism pessimism measure kind of varies depending on what hour of whatever day. So yesterday I was feeling quite pessimistic about the whole thing, but then the two sides agreed to carry on talking. I would just say that as of lunchtime today, there has apparently been some movement on the British side over dispute resolution and governance, and that is quite a positive thing because that's philosophically and in terms of principle been one of the things that's been holding everything up. And apparently the British side have agreed to move a little on that. And if they have, that could start to unblock things. But I would not be surprised if things play out the way Chris has suggested. So we actually pass the 31st of December. They'll still be talking, but we will go into a short no deal period, for example. And then perhaps the consequences of that may sharpen minds even more. But it wouldn't surprise me if they're still talking this time next month.
So you mentioned there are those philosophical differences between the sides. Let's try to get our heads into those a little bit. So I think it's familiar to many of our listeners that the UK government sees sovereignty and maximising the sovereignty of the UK as the key red line that it wants to protect in these negotiations. And Nick, for the EU, what are its principal objectives in these negotiations?
The basic one is not agreeing to anything that will undermine the integrity of the single market and the governance that exists within that. Essentially, what's happening in the UK is it's already left the European Union, and in terms of its future relationship, the EU is concerned that it will have a rich, wealthy, and potentially very dynamic and successful rival competitor off its shores. And it wants to make sure that if this country is going to be trading into the EU single market, that it is following the same rules and obligations that companies operating within the EU have to follow as well. And it's basically about ensuring, as I say, a level playing field. And the issue seems to be, certainly from the UK side, about whether or not we can accept what is presented as being a big infringement on our sovereignty, when in fact it's actually about managing this interdependence between the two and recognising that with privileges, with access comes obligations.
And Valentina, so that's the basic principle that the EU is pursuing here. Are we clear on what its red line is? What's the kind of minimum that it's willing to accept in order to protect the single market?
Single market has been something that has defined the European Union in so many different ways. And when dealing with other countries, like Norway, for instance, this aspect of the single market has been always something that the European Union has attempted to protect. And so the attempt of the United Kingdom to actually reassert its sovereignty has to be understood in line with the necessity of the European Union to maintain, as Anika said, the integrity of the European single market. There are a number of considerations there, right? And I think that the main concern over there, at least for the European Union, is to maintain that level playing field, because when it comes to regulations, it's important that the high standard that the European Union has developed in time are actually somehow reflected in what happens in the UK. The main concern over there is that by leaving the European Union officially, there would be a kind of competitive deregulation. I mean, lowering standards, lowering, the degree of protection that is being established to regulations in order to gain competitiveness. And these are major concerns that the European Union wants to address.
So if I understand correctly, the UK has basically accepted that it's not going to reduce standards that it has already kind of signed up to while it was a member of the EU. But what the UK is kind of objecting to is an insistence from the EU that if the EU increases its standards, the UK should also increase its standards. Is that correct? I mean, is the EU insisting that the UK would follow essentially all increased standards that the EU might decide to introduce in the future?
Well, I think I'm not close enough now to into the negotiations in order to be able to say what exactly the European Union is asking the UK with regard to dynamic alignment. However, what I think is the case is that the EU has one primary objective in these negotiations, and it is to preserve the benefits of the single market to EU members. And I think there is a clear anxiety, on the EU side, that if at some point UK companies and businesses would have access to the single market and can sell their goods tariff-free in the EU, but at the same time would only have to apply lower standards with regard to environment, with regard to workers' rights, and if they could even be helped by the UK government with state aid that would not be legal under EU rules, then that potentially has the big danger for the EU that companies in the EU may ask, oh, so you are benefiting if you leave the European Union? And so the EU definitely wants to prevent this, no? And some people say, in political science, say, no, the EU really faces this accommodation dilemma. This is a term that Stefanie Walter from the University of Zurich has put forward, where she says the EU really has to show that it's very costly for the UK to leave the European Union. At the same time, the EU still wants to hold up cooperation with the UK. And this is to some extent, these two aims are incompatible, because if you make it costly for the UK to be outside of the European Union, then the UK may be less willing to cooperate and to engage in trade deals.
Nick, do come in.
I was just going to say on this point about standards. Essentially, what we're talking about is this idea of dynamic alignment, whereby every time the EU sort of improves or increases its standards, that the UK must do the same. And I think the argument has to some extent moved on from that. As I understand it, it's essentially about whether the UK would agree to mechanisms whereby, if it does not increase its standards in line with the EU, there will be a kind of a graduating tariffs and etc. that will be put in place to balance things out. And I believe that that's one of the things that may have been moving on today, and so there may be a way forward. Because I think the UK sort of saying, well, what's the point if we can't diverge? And I think it's that kind of complexity of how do you, rather than bringing people to the same level of standards, how do you accept someone else not being at that same level? And so if they can find that mechanism, there may be a way forward. And I think one of the issues has been that the UK has been objecting to that in principle, rather than necessarily seeing that actually that's an EU red line that needs to, and that the EU has some sovereignty here as well.
Yeah, so we're thinking that if there is some kind of so-called landing zone on this issue, then it's likely to involve a mechanism by which they come to agree at future points. If there are divergences in the regulations between the UK and the EU, they come to agree what is the appropriate action to take in that circumstance. Good. I see you're nodding. So let's move beyond Brexit. There's a whole lot of other stuff, as I said at the start, also happening in the EU. And just because Brexit is taking place doesn't mean that that is unimportant to people in the UK. And of course, it's very important to people beyond the UK as well. So let's start with the budget. There were some big decisions on the budget at last week's European Council meeting, the meeting of the heads of government and heads of state around the EU. Chris, could you just explain, first of all, how budgeting in the EU works? There's all sorts of jargon around this. There's something called the MFF. There's now something called the Next Generation EU. I can't even remember it myself. What are these things?
The EU does budgeting in multi-year cycles. No? So this MFF is an abbreviation for multi-annual financial framework. And these are frameworks running over 7 years. So the last one was the 2013-2020 MFF, and we are discussing the 2021-2027 MFF. And these MFFs, these multi-annual financial frameworks, they provide a framework for the EU budget. Especially they provide like ceilings on how much money the EU can maximally spend. Yeah. And there we are talking about a sum of around 1,000 billion euros, a bit more than 1,000 billion euros over the 7 years. Normally, this is around a sum for an MFF. And they also define, the MFFs also define like the major headings under which the EU will spend money. So a heading may be agriculture, or cohesion policy. And so these major headings are also fixed in the MFF. And this MFF is a unanimity issue. So all the member states have to vote in favor of the MFF to be passed. And this is the process where we are in with this MFF. And also the European Parliament has, like other parliaments, budget rights there and has to agree to the MFF. However, what many people often forget is that during these 7 years, there's actually quite some leeway in which member states and the parliament together can change appropriations to programs and to member states. And on the margins, you can quite a lot shift around money under these headings, and under the overall ceilings. Now, the big difference with this MFF compared with all other MFFs or other budget cycles before is that we have COVID-19. And the EU has decided in the first half of 2020, basically, under a proposal of the Commission and leadership from especially France and Germany, but also Spain and others, to have a new strategy of how it will address the economic and social fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this plan is called Next Generation EU. And it's basically a top-up to the MFF, which is, however, not a top-up of 10 or 20%. It's actually a top-up of 75%. There are around 75%. There are 750 billions of spending, euro of spending earmarked to fight the pandemic. And that is called Next Generation EU. And it's probably called Next Generation EU. I'm not sure exactly why the Commission did that. But I think it shall signal, on the one hand, that what the EU wants to do with this Next Generation EU additional budget is, it wants to make the EU economy come strong out of the coronavirus crisis, but it also wants to reform it and transform it with regard to the digital economy, on the one hand, and with regard to climate change and environmental issues on the other hand. And in addition, there are some, so that signals that there is like a next generation of the EU coming around with a transformed economy. But on a more expert level, what many people do not look at so much in the public, but what experts look at, there are also other innovations here, because some important innovation is that this 750 billion top-up will basically be financed through new mechanisms. So, for example, the Commission will take out perpetual debt in the financial markets, common debt then of the member states, basically, because the Commission will take out this debt to finance that. And that's quite new. That has been done before, but on a very low, very small scale. And so there is really a transformation in the role of the Commission and in the financial capacities that the Commission has. And on the other hand, there are also no new own resources in that. So own resources are the question of how does the EU get money? And so far, the EU mostly got money by just direct transfers from the member states. And what is changing under Next Generation EU is that the EU gets new tax-like competences. So the EU will impose some digital levy in the future on the digital economy that will be directly collected by the EU, as I understand it. And this is some new tax capacity, basically, that the EU gets. There's also a discussion about a carbon border adjustment. So if you are bringing products into the EU that were produced under very CO2 intensive production procedures, then you may pay an additional tariff or an additional levy to bring it into the EU, and that will also go into the EU budget. So structurally, these are very big changes, also signaling that we have a next generation EU.
So this is a huge change that has taken place in the budget, with a really big increase in spending by 75%, and also a change in the principles, the philosophy of how that money is gathered. Valentina, you're our political economy expert. Is this controversial within the EU?
It is a bit controversial. I think that those big steps wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't because of a major crisis. And so this, I think, has allowed countries to step forward in a way that maybe was not possible or conceivable before. And this is usually what happens when you have a major crisis, where you allow some ideas to emerge and become dominant and reshape how the European Union works. Especially with COVID, there has been this idea of going back to the EU and looking at the EU as a way, to at least provide viable solutions with regard to the difficulties in different countries that have been there and are quite significant. I want to go back to what Christopher has said, and the relevance of these funds, and the idea behind those names, which is actually quite true. It's the idea that you have a more resilient Europe, a different one after this impact that has been triggered by COVID-19. So what is the Europe that will emerge after this? And I guess the title has attempted to translate this idea of a new generation. I think that it's equally interesting to think that sometimes countries do not perceive that they might not have the same perception. For instance, in Italy, we just call it a recovery fund. So it's interesting to see how some ideas at the central level might not be necessarily translated at the national level, where the debate is about simply how do we get out of this crisis, where the debate is how those kind of funds will increase the power of the executive vis-a-vis the parliament. So it's interesting how the conversation within countries is translated according to what is relevant in a given country in that specific moment.
Yeah. Now, there was a big standoff over the budget that was resolved last week at the European Council meeting. And if I understand correctly, this was over the kind of core budget rather than the next generation EU budget. Nick, can you tell us what underlay that standoff?
Well, I think one of the big issues was this idea of linking EU payments to rule of law commitments. And essentially, there's been a big debate over the last 6-7 years about what is seen as perceived as democratic backsliding in certain states, particularly states that joined the EU more recently, most notably Poland and Hungary that joined in 2004, and a sense that even as they were in receipt of lots of particularly financial support from the EU, democratic standards, democratic accountability, the real kind of core qualities that a state should have to be able to join the European Union, that these are being undermined by Viktor Orban's party in Hungary and by Law and Justice in Poland. And that somehow, if you like, the basic kind of requirements of EU membership were being bypassed by these, not only these countries, but particularly these two countries. And so there's been an ongoing debate over the whole kind of budget negotiation period, which has been going on for a good couple of years now, about whether payments, as a way of forcing these countries back onto a more democratic pathway, that financial incentives or financial punishments should be used. And so there's been a strong push by some countries to link money to respect for the rule of law. And obviously, given the given the nature of what that would mean, in particular places like Hungary and Poland, that was very, very controversial. And there has been there's been a dispute between a number of states over whether to do that. So it's very interesting, for example, in this context, to see the role of Germany and whether, how far it's been perceived to have shielded to some extent, particularly Hungary and Poland, away from some of the more the advocates of more active punishment for states that go off the kind of democratic pathway. And so we've had a lot of tension within there, and not surprisingly, and not unreasonable argument on the part of those that are net contributors to the budget, such as the Netherlands, who have said, why should we be paying states that are ignoring democratic rules and obligations?
And what should we think about how this standoff was resolved? Were Hungary and Poland let off the hook, or will their abuses, really, of the rule of law and democracy now be more effectively constrained?
It feels a little bit like a fudge to some extent. I mean, I think there's some movement in that direction, but Hungary and Poland have been given, to some extent, they seem to have got part of what they wanted. And I think it's very interesting, for example, that there was a possibility on these particular issues that the council could have used a sort of majority vote and actually outvoted Hungary and Poland on some of these issues. But the German presidency chose not to go down that particular pathway. So the idea of maintaining consensus was deemed more important than pushing these states too far to the outside. And that is, probably with half an eye on what's been going on with the Brexit negotiations as well. You've got one particular crisis with a departing state. You don't want to push other states too far in that particular direction. But I think you can possibly make an equal argument to say, actually, it's very important for the long-term integrity and sustainability of the EU as a democratic project to actually draw a line in the sand and say, we need to deal with this. And the member states have been very reluctant to really get to grips with this.
Valentina, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I think that the solution was not to come up to an agreement. It was kind of postponing the hurdle for later, and the idea to let the European Court of Justice decide about this entire situation might have been a way to solve the impasse in the short term. But I think that the issue will actually become more significant. The more that time goes by. And as it has been said by Nick, I think this is a question of what the European Union should be like. And it was always about this idea behind building an European Union that is an economic power, but also a place where, human rights are given the right consideration. So there is this tension somehow, and it's at least good that this kind of debate is coming out more and more. And although we saw an impasse right now, a delay to some extent, the issue will come up again. Again, we are operating in a context of a crisis where it's necessary to act fast. But I think that as soon as the situation normalizes, we will hear this debate again. I don't think that Hungary and Poland got off the hook, if that makes sense. It just, it's going to be a question that we will see in another maybe couple of months, 6 months, but it's coming our way.
Interesting. So we should keep a lookout. Let's talk briefly about a few of the other matters on the EU's agenda at the moment. Valentina, you're an expert on digital currencies, virtual currencies, and there's the EU is interested in this area. So I'm definitely an ignoramus in this world. What is a virtual currency? What's the EU thinking in relation to virtual currencies? Why is it important?
It's important for a number of reasons, because it's attempting to protect its own monetary sovereignty to some extent, but also thinking about how to help people through different channels. The European Central Bank is thinking to launch its own digital currency, which would be just another way of thinking about the euro. So it wouldn't be a different type of currency, and this digital currency could be converted into banknotes, for instance, or in deposits in central banks. And the idea behind that became much more apparent with COVID-19, because the idea was that it's not a great idea to use cash. We needed to rely on different payment methods, and there is a problem when it comes to vulnerable people, unbanked people, and therefore the idea was, how do we reach them? How do we facilitate their ability to actually interact with the payment system? So the idea of having a digital currency was there for a while, and as I said, this solves a number of issues, because it allows to some extent to reach unbanked people, but it also allows to solve controversies that were triggered by other virtual currencies, such as bitcoins, which might in the long run represent a challenge to monetary sovereignty, that because of issues of anonymity, they can be used for money laundering. They have been used for money laundering, and to some extent, although limited so far, for terrorist financing. So by developing its own version, the European Central Bank, in general, the European Union, is attempting to limit the use of those virtual currencies, offer a valuable alternative that would be also helpful in terms of monetary policy, because this digital currency could be also interest bearing, and therefore could also allow for a better transmission of monetary policy.
I see. So I was kind of thinking, I can't be alone in having used absolutely no cash at all since March. And all the currency that I have been using has been digital currency. But what we're talking about here is a different kind of thing. So it's something that is accessible even if you don't have a bank account.
Exactly. That's the key. That would be available even if you don't have a traditional bank account. It could be available through intermediaries, or you could hold a sort of wallet wallet at the European Central Bank. They are deciding how to do it, how to go about it. But the idea is that to make payments possible even for people that don't have a classical bank account.
Interesting. Nick, you're a foreign policy expert, and China is, of course, a very important country in the world these days. How are the EU's relations with China?
It's a good question. They are mixed, but then I think that captures China's relationships with many parts of the world. So essentially it is, I would describe it as an indispensable relationship. There's no way these two big actors cannot engage with each other. But depending on the policy area and depending on the topic area, that relationship may be cooperative, it may be competitive, may be more antagonistic. But on big issues, for example, around responding to climate change, it is absolutely essential that the EU finds a way to work with China. And one of the issues that, of course, the EU faces as a single entity is the fact that the Chinese have become quite adept at picking off small individual member states and seeking to build political relationships with those individual states. Partly, for example, through the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. Now, whether those initiatives actually bring any kind of economic or financial benefit to the individual states involved is not so clear. But it does kind of complicate the fact that you have this sort of big external actor that is seeking to engage with and occasionally take part in sort of divide and rule type approaches. And the similar approach to, for example, the United States or to Russia in certain contexts in terms of how it engages with individual states. So the thing that the EU needs to do, one of its kind of big foreign policy priorities, and this is something that was clear when the new Commission and the new High Representative came into office at the end of 2019. Was how do you come up with a clear and coherent strategy for engaging with China, not just over the short term, but sort of across a range of issues, economic sort of financial foreign relations, for example, climate change, etc. And that's still proving to be something of a challenge, particularly then given the way the Chinese have acted and sort of quite antagonistically within their own particular region over Hong Kong, etc. So there are a whole range of issue areas where there are clear opportunities for cooperation, but also some quite major tensions.
Okay, time for just one final question. And we should always remember that the EU is very strongly influenced by its member states. And one of the biggest member states is, of course, Germany. And there will be big change in 2021 when the EU will lose its leading statesperson as Angela Merkel retires after 16 years as German Chancellor. Nick, let's go back to you. Just how important has Angela Merkel been in shaping the EU over the last 16 years?
I would say she's been very important, but I would say she has not necessarily used the power and influence that she could have deployed to as good effect as she perhaps might have done. I think if we look, for example, at the reticence she showed in terms of Germany taking a leadership position in resolving the Eurozone crisis, compared to her willingness then in 2015 to deal with the migration crisis, that very, very different sort of political styles there. And that the migration crisis was a moment when I suggest her political leadership actually took a lot of people by surprise, the fact she was so willing to step out. This is a very cautious politician. She's not given to quick impulse decision making. She kind of likes to weigh the evidence up, but that means that it can sometimes feel that she is perhaps has followed rather than necessarily led. And perhaps that she could have acted more radically. Now, we've obviously just been talking about questions around rule of law, relations with Hungary and Poland, and that was an area where I think, personally, I think she could and should have taken a greater stand. But she has nonetheless been a hugely important, significant, and quite stabilising influence, I would suggest, partly through her longevity, partly through Germany's structural position within Europe. So her departure will inevitably be followed by some degree of political turbulence.
Chris, would you agree with that?
Well, I think it's clear. Yeah, Angela Merkel has played a very important role in the European Union and for its development during the last decades. No, but I think we also shall not overstate this. And I think from outside Europe, especially, people always see Angela Merkel as just the Chancellor of Germany and ruling the EU and just saying what the others should do. But we have actually quite a lot of research from which we know that basically the EU is this great consensus machine, no? And in this great consensus machine where everyone has to agree at some point, or almost everyone has to agree at some point, and almost everyone is accommodated at some point, it's also the case that a lot of medium-sized countries and small countries can have quite some influence and are also shaping the European Union. So I would not overstate this. On the other hand, I think one thing now during the last 16 years where Angela Merkel had quite an influence on the EU was the Eurozone crisis. Now, when the Eurozone crisis hit, I think there the role of Germany was especially important because Germany was just the largest economy in the EU and just economically so important for the EU and also for tackling the Eurozone crisis with basically providing aid to some member states that were in difficulty to pay their debts. And I think her very frugal approach at that moment and her decision for basically imposing conditionality and imposing austerity on the countries that needed help has left quite a deep footprint and not necessarily always positive footprint on the EU. I think a lot of publics have been quite alienated against the EU due to this approach in the Eurozone crisis. And I think she had a large role in shaping this approach. Luckily, she has not, I think, she has learned from this crisis, and I think she is not repeating now these mistakes of alienating partners inside the EU now during the COVID-19 crisis, where she has been much more productive in actually setting up next generation EU, spending together and not trying to impose some kind of German dictate on others.
And Valentina, what would you say will be Angela Merkel's legacy?
Well, it's a difficult kind of answer. I think that for many, she has been considered a sort of arbiter of all the problems that have emerged in the EU. And I agree with Christopher that the EU is this big consensus machine, but maybe when it comes to people, this is not necessarily perceived. So many times it was conceived that Germany was kind of in charge, and this kind of perceptions might not have always helped the image that Germany has, or maybe the way in which people understand and process aspects related to the European Union. But surely she is one of the most powerful women that we had in the European Union. With as far as austerity goes, the decision to implement austerity has not again helped the cohesion within the European Union. I agree that, and we see the changes right now. So I think that no matter what she has done is going to be a difficult, kind of spot to fill. And I agree that there will be a bit of turbulence in order to define new balances and a new equilibrium within the European Union. So we'll see what happens next.
Final question to Chris, this time in your German politics expert capacity. Who should we think will replace her?
To be honest, I think at that moment in time, we fundamentally don't know. Because on the one hand, we don't know who will lead the Christian Democrats, the German Christian Democrats, into the next election. We have in the CDU, now Angela Merkel's party, we have leadership elections coming up in January. We have 3 male politicians there on the ballot. We will see how that goes. But the CSU, the second Christian Democratic Party in Bavaria, the sister party, so of the CDU, they also have someone who would like to become chancellor. So it can be any of them who could lead the Christian Democrats into the next elections. But in addition, I think this adds the real uncertainty. After Angela Merkel has gone, we don't know how the next German elections will go, because I think she is responsible for a lot of support for the Christian Democrats. And we have a strong competitor, which are the Greens. And the Greens are now able in Germany, unlike in other countries, it's a very different Green Party. But this Green Party in Germany is now able in cities, and I'm not even talking about big cities of 1 million inhabitants, but I'm really talking about cities of like 100,000 inhabitants or so, where there are many in Germany. They are able to get 20, 30, in some parts 40% of the vote. And so they could be a real contender. And so they again have other personnel now they would put into the Chancellor's office. So I think at that moment we simply don't know.
2021 will be another extraordinary year in that case, at least in the world of politics, if we really do have a contest between the Christian Democrats and the Greens in Europe's largest country. Extraordinary. Thank you so much, Valentina Amuso, Chris Fratiel, and Nick Wright for guiding us through all of that really important and fascinating terrain. This is the last in the current series of UCL Uncovering Politics. We're going to take a little break over the festive season, but we'll be back in the new year with episodes on topics as diverse as the politics of immigration, the place of care in punishment, and in our first episode of 2021, the link between COVID and conflict. So I do hope you'll want to join us for that. Remember to make sure you don't miss out on future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. All you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Alan Rennick. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.